to listen to the second keynote of the conference, and it's given by Tuulikki Kurki from the University of Eastern Finland. And as you see from this slide, this visit has been supported by the Finnish Instituudi in Estonia. They have this project, 100 talks, and to honor the 100 years of Finland's independence, they have provided grants to invite Finnish speakers to give talks in Estonia. And Tuulikki Kurki is a senior researcher of cultural studies and adjunct professor in folklore research at the Karelian Institute in University of Eastern Finland. And now she's also vice director of the institute. And Tuulikki Kurki is currently principal investigator of the Traumatized Borders, reviving subversive narratives of border and order research project, which is financed by Academy of Finland. It's running until from 2016 to 2020. And in this project, Tuulikki examines written and literary trauma narratives in the territorial and symbolic borderlands between Finland and Russia. She focuses on biographical and fiction novels of various migrants and so-called defectors who moved across the Finnish Soviet Union and the Finnish-Russian borders. So, welcome, Tuulikki.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Pihla, for this introduction. And thank you for the organizers for inviting me here to give this talk. And thank you for the Finnish Institute in Estonia providing a grant for this visit and giving this talk. Before I start, I need to position myself a bit in the field of folklore research. As you heard, my background is in folklore research and in cultural anthropology, but since 2010 I have been very intensively connected with the multidisciplinary field of border studies. And border studies has become a very popular research field since the 1990s, and it seems that it has continued to strengthen its visibility ever since. So since 2010 I have been the principal investigator in 2 Academy of Finland projects which strongly connect with border research and border studies. So the move from folklore research to this multidisciplinary context, and also personally moving to work in the Karelian Institute, which is a multidisciplinary research institute, has changed a bit about what I think about the research concepts and research objects that are common in folklore research. And I look at this differently than before. But in the end, I think these moves have been very kind of profitable and fruitful for my own thinking. So my presentation today is based on partially on my ongoing research on border crossing people at the Finnish-Russian national borderlands. And partially my talk is also a thought experiment because it plays with the question what happens to some of the concepts used in folklore, like folk and people, when the folkloristics expanded towards border studies. So I'll start with this slide as a starting point and a contextualizing point of my talk. According to the United Nations, today there are over 65 million people who have left their homes more or less permanently. In addition, in their daily lives, millions of people travel across the borders, national borders, because of work, leisure, or for family reasons. And on this slide you can see one visualization of these global migration flows. So my intention is not to start to study this diagram in detail, but it's important to note that the vastly increased mobility forces also us to critically assess the core concepts in folklore research, like in many other disciplines as well. In folkloristics, for long, concepts such as culture, identity, and tradition have been defined as territorially bound concepts, and they have been linked strongly with the ideas of place, locality, territory, and nation. However, when these mobile people moving across the borders, for example migrants, and people living at various borderlands are chosen in the focus of research, it makes us to redefine our concepts and research objects in new ways or in alternative ways. Placing these mobile people in the focus exposes also those discourses and power hierarchies that define and maintain our concepts in research. So in my presentation I focused on mobile border-crossing people and their narratives at the Finnish-Russian borderlands in the 20th and 21st centuries. And their narratives are about border crossings, about belonging, about losing home, facing the other, and defining one's own identity. In the context of the so-called national order of the 20th century Finland, these experiences and life stories of these people remained often invisible because simply they didn't fit in the ideas of dutiful citizens or ideal citizen maintained by the national order of that time. And therefore these narratives are now also devices through which we can assess critically these concepts like folk and tradition today. And furthermore, these narratives generate a need for alternative concepts for analysis. And I suggest that these alternative concepts could be something like hyperspace or border performatics, for example. So in the following, I will first introduce the research materials a bit and those people who have been writing these narratives and works that I study. Then I go through examples of these border-crossing narratives. These examples are first from the early 20th century and then examples from today, closer to present day. Then I introduce the concepts of hyperspace and border performatics as instruments for further analysis of these narratives. And in the end, I suggest that when we recognize these mobile people as objects of research, it may be reasonable to use such concepts as border law and border people. But let's find out what happens in the end. So here's some examples of my research materials. They include both unpublished and published writings from the 1920s until the present. And the selection on the slide shows just some of these works. And these titles show something very essential about the viewpoint and approach of these works on this border-crossing theme. There are such titles that Tour in Siberia, We Flew into New World, Red Terror, Story of the Cursed, for example. So it's not a very romantic genre, as you may notice. So these materials include kind of eyewitnessing accounts, memoirs, biographies, but also fiction work. And in the early 20th century, this documentary value was kind of made more important, and it was always stressed that this is really real story or this is document of what happened. But during the latter half of the 20th century and today, the fiction has become also quite prominent, and fiction has provided an important alternative channel or medium for discussing these border-crossing themes. So, who are these people then that have been writing these works? In the early 20th century, several different kinds of groups of Finns crossed the national border and became authors of these works. One of the groups was the migrants moving from Finland to the Soviet Russia after the 1918 civil war in Finland, and after the Finnish-Russian national border was established in 1918 and the Finnish civil war had ended, over 15,000 Finns moved into Russia and later into the Soviet Union. The emigrated people were often working class people and represented communist ideology or felt affiliation towards it. By escaping Finland, many of them escaped also prison or death penalty or grim life that was expected for them if they had stayed in Finland. Among these migrated people were also highly influential politicians who received later recognition even in Kremlin. But the majority were working class people who did not see life opportunities in Finland, and they sought for both political support and chances for better life on the Russian side of the border. And many of these people later returned back to Finland and then wrote about their experiences and life stories. But there were also other groups of migrants. There were Finnish-American migrants coming into Soviet Union from United States and Canada in 1920s and 1930s. In addition, there were those Finns who lived already in the borderland area, but during the First World War and after establishing the national border, they were unable to return to Finland. And also people from these groups have been writing about their life experiences. Then after the Second World War, the Iron Curtain kind of blocked the mobility across the border until the 1990s. But then mobility has kind of revived to a degree. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, approximately 6,000 people have moved from Finland to Russia, and close to 52,000 people have moved from Russia to Finland. And these numbers show that there is still some mobility across the border. And many of these migrants move because of family reasons and work-related reasons. And there are also contemporary writers who have migrated from Russia to Finland and wrote about their experiences and life stories. But they have also been writing about these historical processes and earlier migrants. And as I said, there has now been a shift from these eyewitness stories towards fiction narratives and more artistic ways of narrating these experiences. And because these experiences can be often quite difficult and traumatic, these artistic metaphors and artistic ways of expression can kind of help to articulate these experiences in public. So what then these border crossing experiences are about? It must be noted that these narratives are not just any kind of memoirs or life stories. They are rather grim ones, and they have a certain structure often. They start usually with a description of border crossing from Finland to Soviet Union or Soviet Russia, and they end with crossing the border back to Finland. And these narratives often involve strong emotions, difficult, even traumatic experiences, affects expressions of fear and hopes towards the other on the other side of the border. Here are some examples of the border crossing moment, how it alone is a very emotional experience when leaving the earlier home and perhaps family behind and facing the unknown. So examples are like, tears filled my eyes and blinded me. The memoirs of my past life rushed like a frantic sparrows in my mind. We had entered into a strange country. I must say, everything seemed very confusing. I swayed between the two worlds, Finland and Russia, west and east, and I now stood on this side of the border, still unstable. The majority part of these works and narratives describe daily struggle in new life conditions, in difficult conditions, in prison camps, and survival of the author or the main protagonist. These migrated people often faced and witnessed violence and witnessed death and faced the threat of violence and death on both sides of the national border, because many migrants escaped difficult life conditions and political oppression in Finland. And however, on the Soviet side of the border, their hopes for better life were not often realized, and many of them were imprisoned as illegal border crossers, and later many continued to live in harsh and poor conditions. And here are some quotes. At times I wished that it all was just a cruel dream. Would I reach happiness after crossing the border, or was it written in the stars that my road was filled with pain and misery? Even today my pen refuses to write about those events in detail. Black sorrows fell on me. So typical for these border crossers narratives is that they narrate about experiencing or witnessing violence, death or dread of them, and the person kind of assumes doing the right thing when moving to another country, maybe to find work and better life. However, the person is suddenly convicted as a criminal, or when the person is returning back to Finland, he is treated as a defector or traitor and convicted or despised by the popular opinion. And also kind of dreams and hopes for a better life on the other side of the border are destroyed, and the person feels there's no future for him or her anymore. And the narratives also narrate about exclusion, experiences of homelessness, otherness, and in-betweenness. And in this way, these traumas are also trauma narrative. These narratives are also trauma narratives because the border crossing and facing the hardships leads to shattering of one's worldview, and leads usually to slow, gradual rebuilding of a new identity, which are the trademarks of cultural trauma, for example. So the contemporary reception of these works denied the severity of experiences that these people had gone through, and the reception rejected their narrative from the grand national narrative in Finland, and they were partially silenced, and the experiences were questioned, and they were not taken as our stories, and this created kind of ideological homelessness, or a state of not belonging for these migrants. So what I mean with this home or homelessness or belonging and not belonging here, belonging to a place, home, nation or homeland can be understood also as an ideological construct in the framework of the so-called national order. This national order includes an idea of mapping an ideology onto a place and, for example, on a nation's territory. And these spatial structure representations of the world, they are held in a taken for granted way. Thus, in the context of national order represents certain values, attitudes maintained by the dominating groups in power. National order, of course, supports the idea of nation and position of those groups who are in power. And national order, for example, supports the idea of identities that are rooted in territorial homeland. National order of things, for example, makes obvious the need to control the movement of people who are seen to be out of place. In the context of national order, home and belonging to a place signify kind of normalized, imposed order and identification to a place and nation. For example, home can be understood as a micro-level embodiment of the national order, and therefore also home includes the idea of mapping ideology onto a space and place. And home can also represent a naturalized, normalized order. On the other hand, the margins of home can tell us something about normality, in quotation marks, and about us, in quotation marks, and the ones that belong to home, or about those who do not belong home. So what did this belonging and national order mean in early 20th century Finland when these migrants wrote about their experiences? First, it meant that the Order of White Finland was established after the 1918 Civil War. Second, it meant the order which was created by the Cold War that prevailed from the late 1940s until the end of 1980s. This national order of the White Finland defended the values shared by the middle and upper class population who had won the 1918 Civil War. Furthermore, the purpose of the national order was to protect the nation against the outside threats. Internally, its purpose was to prevent the new civil war. Those groups of people that belonged to the leftist movements or communism were made enemies that threatened the national order. The national order of the White Finland was strengthened after the Second World War and during the Cold War. Then also started the period of the so-called Finlandization that meant extremely cautioned public opinions towards the Soviet Union. The situation created quite a controversial political atmosphere and media atmosphere in Finland. Nevertheless, it created a polarized discussion about political East and West. Against this background, the ideological homelessness by the border-crossing migrants meant that they were wrong persons in the wrong place. This often resulted in exclusion and isolation. It could lead to a situation where individuals were not assimilating into the environment and the social networks, but remained outside the prevailing normalized structures. And this homelessness can be seen also as a threat to the prevailing social order. If I make a connection to folklore research now, so the national order has influenced also the ideas of folk and tradition in folklore research, as we all know already. In Finland, for example, the early folklore research saw some of the cultural features at the national borderlands as worthless, sinful, ugly, grotesque and dirty, and therefore unfit in the Finnish national culture. And these cultural features were seen as the opposite to the own pure Finnish culture. In this way, those borderland people, their identities and cultures that were unsuitable into national frame were made the other and the alien in the context of the national order. The borderland cultures, traditions and people have often remained invisible in Finland, but also globally, because for long there has been no concepts for studying them. Renata Rosalto has used expressions people without culture and culturally invisible people. Hastings Donnan and Thomas Wilson, geographers, have used expression transnational groups that do not have their own culture. These all refer to visibility and invisibility of cultures in research as well as in society. The concepts of classical anthropology as well as folklore have paid more attention to cultural entities and wholes than borderlands of cultures or hybridized forms of cultures, and therefore many cultural features at borderlands and people at borderlands have remained in between analytical categories and concepts. They have remained also unrecognized and invisible in research. How could we then better recognize these people and their traditions? Now becomes the experimental part. Let's then move to the idea of hyperspace, a concept that could lead to recognition of borderland traditions, culture forms and identities. Here I refer to concept hyperspace defined by folklorist Doug Thompson, literature researchers Frederick Jameson and Hazel Smith. And here's short definition what it means. Its keywords are dislocation, decentered, subjectivity, disorientation, in-betweenness, homelessness, and virtuality. Doug Thompson defines hyperspace as the territorial entity that questions the national frame of concepts, and it can function as a basis for new post-national and emergent identities. Hazel Smith defines hyperspace as a new textual, political and subjective space. Frederick Jameson defines hyperspace as a postmodern space characterized by disorientation and is a space where individual does not have any stable position. What I mean here in my research with hyperspace, I mean it is a space shared by individuals who are living or moving across the borders in various borderlands. It is based on shared experiences of in-betweenness, belonging to nowhere, or shared experiences, or even traumatic events, border-related traumatic events that, for example, can cause shattering person's worldview and leads to redefinition of his/her or identity. So this hyperspace is not any kind of utopian, beautiful world, but it's ugly, disharmonious, and contradictory. Hyperspace is also constructed virtually and artistically in writing or producing artwork and in receiving them. So it can be produced in other forms than in literature as well. Well, next, some examples of how hyperspace could emerge in works of border-crossing writers. And now we move to present day. The first example is by writer Arvi Perttu, who was born in the Soviet Union in 1961, and he moved in Finland in 2001, and he writes in Finnish. His work, Symposium of Petrozavodsk, was published in 2001, and it's about crossing a symbolic border from the Soviet era to the post-Soviet era. And this border crossing has been described as a very emotional experience, even a traumatic experience, because it caused sudden, deep and profound change in the worldview, lifestyle and values of all Soviet citizens. And it also leads to a need to create new post-Soviet identities. So this book, Symposium of Petrozavodsk, describes the late 1980s in the town of Petrozavodsk in Russian Karelia, when the Soviet Union is disintegrating. A group of artists try to manage their professional careers and personal lives, which gradually turn into a nightmare. Arvi Perttu uses two metaphors for describing the symbolic border crossing in this situation, and I think these metaphors aptly describe experiences of many other border crossers as well. The first metaphor is a mirror. In the book, the surrounding society is in a state of chaos. Both the past and the future have been turned out as illusions. The main protagonist thinks that his life is falling into pieces, and he's not sure about who he is. He looks at himself in a bathroom mirror where his unrecognizable image is mirrored countless times, and this makes him doubt which of the images is real and which is an illusion, and this makes him doubt also his own identity, and he gets an idea that he himself does not exist anymore. So the protagonist says, "I cannot perceive the multiplicity of the world, and therefore my normal state of mind is confusion and irresolution. I know well this state of mind when I am not sure of my existence." The second metaphor is a corridor, which describes the transition from the past to the future. The corridor is dark. Its roof has holes where light shines through. The main protagonist is scared and horrified, but a dream of a better future pushes him forward in the tunnel. An endless narrowing corridor, black holes in its walls, are entrances to other worlds, but Fool is afraid to approach them, even though he knows that there is the light. Sunlight comes through the tiny holes, but can you be sure that the light is not only neon light? These metaphors express the border crosser's experience in space and time, where the relationship between the past, present and future has become ambivalent. On one hand, the past represents the other, which the main protagonist wants to leave behind. On the other hand, the present is chaotic, which makes him to feel nostalgic towards the past life and long for the coherent worldview and unbroken identities that it maintained. The relationship to the future is also problematic. The future that the socialism promised for the Soviet citizens and which served as the basis for their future plans never comes true. This leaves the main protagonist without a clear idea about where he comes from and where he is heading. The coherent narrative which leads from the past to the future is broken. Therefore, there is no fixed world or fixed narrative where the character could base his identity. The traumatic experience caused by the symbolic border crossing detaches the main protagonist from the experience of coherent time and space, and therefore the main protagonist moves in a paradoxical time and space which exists after the future that never came true. And here I'm referring to Michael Epstein's term, after the future, and the present is just shattered and empty. The third border crossing metaphor I want to introduce is a red square from Arvi Perttu's novel Pain. This novel narrates about historical events, the civil war in the early 1920s in the Russian Karelia at the Finnish-Russian borderland. And this civil war divided the population with the question whether Soviet power should be established in the area or should Karelia remain separate from the Soviet Union. And this war made even family members to the enemies of each other. Also, Finns participated in the war on both sides of the war and with their own motives. So this novel Pain describes the individuals in the war, their motives, feelings, emotions. The metaphor red square in the novel refers to Kazimir Malevich's famous artwork Black Square, which was made in the 1920s. Black Square was a symbol of emptiness, nothingness, and eternity, and similar meanings are attached to the red square as well. In the novel, Red Square refers to the feelings of emptiness and frustration that the main protagonists experience in the war. It is also a symbol of destruction, death, and eternity. In the novel, the protagonists are unsure about on which side of the war they should belong, who are their allies and who are their enemies. And some of them feel simultaneous love and hate towards the enemy. And this causes them mental pain and ignites suicidal wishes even. And they are ready to die to forget the situation. However, the destruction doesn't really promise them oblivion, but only eternal pain. So this Perttu's work connects also with the so-called hypernaturalism that has been one trend in contemporary Russian literature. Hypernaturalism depicts grim, violent, pessimistic world, the cruelty of everyday life in ways that are often despised or in ways that create strong reactions in the reading audience. According to literature researcher Mark Lipovetsky, the critical reactions often indicate that this kind of hyper-realistic prose can read such traumatic and difficult events in the past that has been previously pushed back, but now they can be brought in our consciousness and they can be discussed about through this kind of hyper-naturalistic means of narration. So this mirror corridor and red square are just few examples that are attached to border crossings at the Finnish-Russian national borderlands. And these are just few examples, but what is common to these examples and other border literature that I've been reading is that crossing the border kind of shatters the worldview and identity of the person and takes him or her into a state of uncertainty and confusion, and this may call in question the whole existence of the person. The feelings of belonging to nowhere, feelings of being in between, and continuous otherness are stressed. In these border crossing experiences, it's typical that the relationship between past, present, and future also becomes very complicated, and the identity of the border crosser is based beyond coherent experience of place and time, like the mirror metaphor, corridor metaphor indicated. However, the border crosser may not wish to integrate into the new society or return to old one, and for this reason, voicing these border crossing experiences may be seen as identity performances and means for empowerment for these people at Borderlands. And this idea of identity performance connects these narratives with the concept border performatics, which is a concept that has been introduced in literature and culture studies on US-Mexico border. The concept refers to the identity performances and definitions of identities made by people at borderlands by themselves. And these definitions are kind of breaking down and opposing the identity definitions that are imposed on these people from above or from outside perspectives. And this border performatics has been an important instrument to various minority groups living at borderlands. And I think that's also in this hyperspace that is created in literature and other art forms at Finnish-Russian borderlands, that hyperspace can function as an instrument for border performatics and articulation of such identities and perhaps traditions that perhaps were not able to become public earlier. At the Finnish-Russian borderland, literature and other art forms can, for example, express such border and mobility-related traumas that have been silenced before or rejected from the grand national narratives and nationally defined cultures. And in this way, literature and art can express a counter voice to those identity and culture definitions that tend to homogenize or see as a one group the people living at the borderlands. After going through these examples, my final question is, and you can participate in discussing this, could it be possible to formulate concepts such as border law and border people? Traditions usually mean continuity, but borderlands are often understood as areas of change, discontinuity and heterogeneity. For example, in previous folklore research at the US-Mexico border, the concept of border law has referred to mixed forms of two or more nationally defined cultures that meet at the borderland. And based on this idea, I suggest that border law could be both territorial and deterritorial, and it can exist in oral, written or visual forms. So border law connects to a specific territorial borderland and its specific history, and it can absorb influences from dominating literature, art, traditions, for example, on each side of the border. But it can also include narratives of violence, oppression and conflicts that, for example, the dominating cultures have directed towards the borderland population. At the same time, border law is also deterritorial. Then the shared experiences of borders, bordering, in-betweenness, ambiguity, homelessness connect these people. And border law is then transmitted through media that can overcome territorial, cultural and social boundaries. For example, in reception of literature and artworks. And for example, nowadays in internet there is a huge selection of the so-called border art, which can be accessed all around, and I think there is something that connects them all. Then is it possible to formulate such a thing than border people that produces its own tradition? Recognizing border people means that we have to reject the national order and nationally oriented frame of analysis and move to the order created by the mobility and the mobile world. And then I think the border people could be formed by groups living at various global borderlands, for example. But of course it's interesting to ask that who is defining and giving meaning to these cultural traits and people living at borderlands, and how research is contributing to this and or involved in the process. So it's not important to just move from one power discourse to another when conceptualizing these phenomena. But at the moment it seems that people living at various borderlands are taking more and more kind of visible role in defining and articulating their identities. So I think these are some of the questions I think we can talk. But if we have still time, I'm asking the chair, yes. In the end, I would like to introduce shortly the research project Traumatized Borders, Reviving Subversive Narrative of Border, Order and Other, which this presentation is part of. So, so this is our research project funded by the Academy of Finland, and it's placed in Karelian Institute in University of Eastern Finland, and it has started a year ago, and it will run until the end of August 2020. So you can find more information on the website www.uf.fi Traumatized Borders. But I introduce shortly the main idea of the project. So the project focuses on border and mobility-related traumatic experiences in Finnish, Estonian, Russian, and North American contexts. It focuses also encounters at cultural borders and various processes of exclusion and inclusion. And the viewpoint starts from the early 20th century and extends to the present, so we have it's kind of a long perspective to these processes. And narratives that we kind of study about these experiences and processes are both textual and visual, and we kind of understand the narrative very kind of widely. Okay, I think it's time perhaps to end here, and of course I'm ready to talk more about the project as well. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Tuulikki. It was a very inspiring talk, and also it was nice that you brought it closer to folklore studies. And I'm sure we can continue with the questions and comments from the public.
Thank you for the talk. I was wondering if you could say a few words about the reception of the works of these authors that you were discussing, and how they have been received in Finland, and has it been translated into Russian, for example, this Vestlussari book or books like this? Have, you know, is the reception also on the border and kind of nowhere as the theoretical thing?
Yes. Okay, yes, thank you. The reception has changed a lot. So if I draw a quick line from the early 20th century to present, early 20th century, the experience of these authors were kind of played down, and because they didn't fit the idea of what Finnish nation should be and what's the ideal citizen, and they were not taken kind of seriously, and at some point some of these works were even put on a blacklist, kind of censored, because they showed so negative attitude towards Soviet Union, and this kind of controversial reception and silencing continued until 1980s, and after that it suddenly changed, so that more writings about this experience started to come up, and kind of they were accepted more openly. And for example, if you know this Finnish writer Taisto Huuskonen, whose book Lapsi Suomen, Child of Finland, was very controversial, it suddenly became a subject of theater plays and even musicals, which sounded kind of weird, because how can you make a musical out of this kind of theme? But then they were suddenly accepted, like part of our story and part of group of Finns that has gone through. And then about reception on the Russian side, for example, Arvi Perttu's works have been translated in Russia, at least partially, but his reception has been also a bit controversial, because at least in the local level in Russian Karelia, where he comes from, his works has been seen as too Western in his viewpoints and not really part of our literature. And on the Finnish side, he's many times regarded as maybe too Russian writer. So he feels that he has said himself that he has a native language, Finnish, which he uses to write, but he doesn't have homeland. And so he feels this kind of in-betweenness very, very strongly.
which is in itself very interesting because often writers are kind of identified based on the language that they write in. It's not so easy. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you for the talk. I'm John Björkman from Academy, and you mentioned that in the early 20th century, during the process of creating a national identity, certain elements of the folk culture were lifted up and other elements were kind of marginalized and seen as impure. Can you tell a little bit more about that, and do you know, is there any research on that subject? It's very interesting.
There must be research, but it's not research nowadays, because I can't really recall exact books which would have discussed this in more detail. But I used as a source these writings of this person who made fieldwork in the border area in late 19th century, early 20th century. And they kind of very explicitly name that this type of tradition is dirty and tarnished because it obviously had connections to Russian folklore, and so they really picked up that this is not pure Finnish folklore that we are looking for, and they extended this attitude even towards people who didn't look like the ideal Finn in the national costume, and they kind of separated that these people are shorter and they look different, they're not us. So this is based on the fieldwork notes that I've been reading.
Okay, because some, even in Western Finland, many elements of the folk culture that are very old died out quite rapidly in that period, and some people have connected this to the process of creating a national identity. It would be very interesting to delve deeper into that.
Yeah, I'm sure this happened in other places as well, and also in northern Finland, Lapland, and there. So, true, very interesting.
I was thinking about this. You have studied both autobiographical and fiction texts. So I thought that maybe in a way this fiction is an easier way to express some of the difficult emotions. But do you see a difference between these different kind of texts?
Yes, that's a very good question. Of course, my analysis of the whole material is still unfinished. I'm in the middle of process, but it seems that in the earlier books, people were after all, quite cautious to write about their own emotions and experiences, and some of the books are quite reporting that what happens, and they may suddenly just say that 6 of my friends just disappeared last night, and then you can just imagine what happens, and they are more cautious. But for example, today in Arvi Perttu's work, he's a good example. He uses very grotesque examples and takes it to in such extremes that you just get flushed when you when you read it, because and I think this use of grotesque is definitely a device which you can use for waking readers up and make understand how this might feel. So there is definitely difference, and I think these artistic genres give very good addition to how to talk about traumatic experiences and this type of things.
Have you thought about yourself experimenting with this in writing, that kind of writing in a different way, not the usual research report style?
I think my writing skills do not extend so far, but good idea. Maybe some visual representation could be an idea as well, and other type of completely other thing than writing could be, and I work for me.
Yeah. Some questions or comments still?
Yeah, thanks for your inspiring talk. This is maybe a silly question, but still yet. You are talking about the experiences of crossing the border, of living in a country that have to do with trauma. And is there any considerable research you know of when it was perceived as a good thing, when the life changed into the good life when it something like that. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like a positive thing, like a positive turn of life.
Do you mean research or books about both?
Research.
Research, obviously. Okay. Well, of course, there's tons of literature about in border studies about discussing these themes, and in Finnish-Russian context, it's more about being written about in this EU context and stressing the cooperation, and they're not so much from individual point of view. That kind of narratives exist a lot, like the but the true life stories. Maybe there's, I can't really name any, but the reason might be that then maybe people themselves don't write about these experiences when everything is going well, so they don't produce material that could be studied. But I can't give more detailed answer on this, but it's a good point.
I was asking because there are many cases when, like in the Russian-speaking internet, those who somehow left their country sometimes perceive it as a great change of life. Their improved financial state, they feel more secure and feels better climate and so on and so forth, no matter where they left. Yeah.
Okay, that's a good example, and we have to find more of those stories as well. Not to create too grim image of border crossing.
Just comparative material.
Yeah.
Thanks.
If we are done with the questions, we can continue the discussion during the excursions, maybe.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.